afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation by Professor Cristina Rivera Garza. This event is part of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center's 2020-21 public event series, Living Democracy, which has been exploring the conditions under which democracy can flourish, the forces that imperil it, and the political, social, and cultural interventions needed for democracy to realize its full potential as an inclusive, equitable, and just political system. I want to make sure our audience members are aware of the question and answer function on the screen. Since this is a webinar, we do not have the ability to have the audience interact directly with our speaker, but you can submit your questions in English or Spanish at any time during the event, and Professor Rivera Garza will address them after her presentation. Also, this event will be recorded and available online in a few weeks. In the post-webinar survey, you can sign up for our mailing list to be notified when it becomes available. My name is Suzanne, and I'm the director of the Humanities Center. I want to extend my thanks to the Spanish interpreters for this event, Professors Viola Emilio and Aline Ferreira, and to the ASL interpreter, Katie Voice. Thanks as well to the staff members who coordinate our programs. IHC Associate Director Erin Nerstad, Assistant Director Adam Morrison, and Senior Artist Paula Schaefer. I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Cristina Rivera Garza. Professor Rivera Garza received her BA from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and her PhD from the University of Houston. She was affiliated with the San Diego State University, ITESMA Campus Toluca, and the University of California, San Diego, before joining the faculty of the University of Houston in 2016, where she is currently Distinguished Professor of Hispanic Studies and Creative Writing and Director of the PhD in Creative Writing in Spanish program. Professor Rivera Garza is an award-winning author of fiction, essays, and scholarship. Her recent publications and recent translations of her earlier works include The Taiga Syndrome, translated by UCSB Professor Emeritus Suzanne Jill Levine and Aviva Kana, The Iliac Crest, translated by Sarah Booker, Autobiografía del algodón, Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country, translated by Sarah Booker, The Restless Dead, Necrowriting and Disappropriation, translated by Robin Myers, and La Castañeda Insane Asylum, Narratives of Pain from Modern Mexico, translated by Laura Kanost. Professor Rivera Garza is also a 2020 MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant recipient. I am delighted to welcome Professor Rivera Garza to the virtual IHC to deliver her talk, What We Can Do for Each Other.
Thank you so much, Susan. Buenas tardes a todos. Qué gusto estar aquí y compartir con ustedes. I'm really delighted. I'm very happy to be here on a campus that is very important to me. I have great friends over there at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I, in fact, taught for a while in a summer program some years ago, perhaps even as long as 10 years ago. So there's much effect surrounding my relationship to UCSB, and that makes this talk even more meaningful to me. So thank you again, Suzanne, for the invitation. Thank you to each one of you, the members of this community that has made this possible. Thank you to my friends and colleagues in the Spanish department for their translation and interpretation, and thank you to all the interpreters right here. So this is what I'm planning to do today. I'm going to be reading and talking from and about my recent book, Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country, translated by the wonderful, really talented, bright translator, Sarah Booker. And then I'll do that for about 30 minutes. After that, I'm going to be really eager, looking forward your questions. I love when these presentations become what they are, right? Pieces of a longer dialogue, a dialogue that I try to maintain through books, and it is always a privilege to translate that dialogue from writing to this format. Even though this is only virtual, I think it helps us enormously. So I have a couple of notes just to orient myself throughout this talk. And so let me see. I've chosen lines by two contemporary women writers for the title and subtitle of this talk. So let me just unpack them a little. In Don't Let Me Be Lonely, esteemed author Claudia Rankine defined loneliness as what we cannot do for each other. So what we can do for each other is the opposite of loneliness. It is there in that shared practice that we may find one another, generating and reproducing community. On the other hand, anthropologist Christina Sharp explored the concept and practice of wake work in her book, In Waking, on Blackness and Being, describing it as a shared form of grieving that is in fact a woke moment, the way in which we realized we live in fact on layers upon layers of suffering and trauma, which allows her to claim that the past is never fully the past. The past has always a way of erupting in the present. I believe that there are many connections between her concept of wake work and what I describe in the pages that comprise Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country. So that's the kind of connection that I'm going to try to make throughout this talk. I am convinced that democracy is way more than casting a vote. True democracy is achieved when we fully and dynamically engage with others, adding our proverbial grain of salt to the making and remaking of our communities. Writing is, to me, one of these powerful community-making practices that might lead us to critical thinking and, when lucky, to critical practice too. So I would like to start today's event by reading a poem I wrote some time ago, perhaps 2010, when I was struck by the power of the words enunciated by Luz Maria Davila, a working class woman from Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, right on the border, on the US-Mexico border, after she lost her two sons to violence, to the misnamed war on drugs, which is in fact, as many of us know, a war on people, the war on us. And when she uttered these words, when she had the opportunity to face then President Felipe Calderón. So let me start. If you have the book with you, I'm in page 15. The claimant. Excuse me, Señor Presidente, for not extending my hand. You are not my friend. I cannot welcome you. You are not welcome. No one is. Luz María Dávila, Villas de Salvarcar, mother of Marcos and José Luis Piña Dávila, 19 and 17 years old. It isn't fair. My little boys were at a party and they were killed. Massacre of Saturday, January 30th in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, 15 deaths. Because here in Ciudad Juárez, put yourself in my place, Villas de Salvarcar, my back, my fulminous paradox. For 2 years, they have been committing murders. They are committing many things. To commit is a shining verb, a radiant vertigo, a lethargic tremor. They are committing many things and no one does anything. And I only want there to be justice, and not only for my two boys, the dead, distressed, the fulminous, massacred, the shining, lost ones, but for everyone, justice, to confront, spit out, claim, accuse, demand, call for, require, defend. Don't tell me, of course, do something. If your child had been killed, you could leave no stone unturned looking for the murderer. Under the rocks, under the rocks, under. But because I don't have the resources, alms for the birds, my bones, my flesh, from your flesh, my flesh. Put yourself in my place, put yourself, my shoes, my nails, my stellar shiver. I can't look for them because I don't have resources. I have the death of my two sons. The actor, burial in open sky, that literally means give alms to the birds. I have my bag, my tear, my hammer. I don't have justice. Put yourself in their place. Villas de Salvarcar, there where they kill my two sons. You are not my friend. This is the hand I do not extend to you. Put yourself, Señor Presidente, in your place. I give you my back, my thirst. I give you my unknown shiver, my distressed tenderness, my shining birds, my death. And the short woman with the blue sweater left the room, wiping away her tears. I was reading poetry, some poems by Ramon López Velarde, Mexican poet from the late 19th, early 20th century, when I ran into an article written by journalist Sandra Rodriguez. It was an article about an incident that had taken place during the recent visit of President Calderón to Ciudad Juárez, deemed by then one of the most dangerous cities in the world, if not the most dangerous city in the world. I was moved, and rather I was shaken to the core by that article, especially by the words the journalist quoted, a series of brave, resilient words uttered by Luz Maria Dávila herself. I knew then, almost immediately, I did not have to write a poem about these words, but to incorporate these very words in a verbal artifact that could take them to faraway places and to other audiences. Writing here was not giving a voice, because the voice was there. The voice existed in its own. But my task was to configure a shared space of deep listening and shared grieving. It was, in a way, a first step into the wake work. You know, we live in societies very wary of time. Our idolatry for youth, for example, our refusal to accept that we grow old and therefore become increasingly infirm, needing the care from others, might as well be a way to remain unaffected by time. But time does exist. We are time embodied. Paying attention to time means we embrace vulnerability and we embrace our dependency on others. Paying attention to time means we're willing to reject indifference. We are willing to remove ourselves from that form of militant indifference that leads into indolence. It is hard to translate the word Dolerse, which is the original title of this book, and my colleagues from the Spanish department will confirm this, I'm sure. Dolerse literally means to pain with others, to feel the pain others feel. In this way, dolerse means grieving, indeed, although the emphasis in Spanish is more physical, I believe, more corporeal. When we grieve, when we pain ourselves with or through the pain of others, we need to pose the question about the reasons, the causes behind the tragedy or tragedies that triggered various ways of social suffering. And here lies, I believe, the critical potency of dolence, as in the opposite of indolence. whereas the incapacity to grieve for others renders us isolated and lonely, unable to do anything for them. The potency of shared suffering alerts us to what we can, in fact, do for each other. Suffering, I argue in this book, is not a passive process, and victims are not fatalistic actors devoid of agency. Whereas terror breaks us from the inside, annihilating even our capacity to articulate language, pain, the experience of shared grieving, allows us to re-articulate ourselves with language and therefore with others. The language of pain, of course, is varied. It sometimes comes as a religious idiom, some others under the disguise of scientific parlance. Either way, it allows us to identify and connect as we struggle against the causes of our misfortune. And this is why I'm directly and organically linking grieving to a critical awareness of our surroundings, of what we can actually do from the position we find ourselves in on this earth. And that's the reason I'm now moving into another discussion that is very important in this book, and it's migration. We live in a country built on the energy and potency of migration. And migrating stories are hard, even though we hear many migrating stories, I still believe that they are stories very hard to tell because many of them are trauma stories. I am myself the granddaughter of migrating grandparents who left little in terms of documents or testimonies about their long, painful journeys. I have recently published a book exploring these experiences. It's the title in Spanish is Autobiografía del algodón, yet to appear in English as Autobiography of Cotton. You see, my paternal grandparents walked all the way up from San Luis Potosí in what is known as the Mexican Altiplano to the coal mining region of northern Coahuila, only to settle around the cotton fields on the Texas-Tamaulipas border a little after that. My maternal grandparents crossed the US-Mexico border when they were children, growing up and working and getting married and forming families in the United States, only to be pushed out in the 1930s when President Hoover issued a very strict cruel anti-immigrant legislation, very similar to the practices and laws that we witnessed and endured during the last 4 years in this country, by the way, specifically targeting Mexicans. My relatives found their way back to a country they knew little about, my maternal grandparents, but I welcomed them around to the cotton fields of the border. I decided to write about this experience in the book that I mentioned before, but I've tried some other narratives as well. And one of them involved the words by my very dear and admired Lina Meruane, a Chilean-born writer who lives right now in New York. She wrote a book, Volver Palestina, Become Palestine. And I wrote a section of Grieving, Volverse Palestina, that's the title of Lina Meruane's book that I'm referring to. I wrote one of the pieces in Grieving relates to a conversation I developed specifically with this work by Lina Meruane, incorporating to the migrating history of my grandparents. A tradition of long walks. The ships set sail from Haifa, says Meruane, and were docked in some Mediterranean port before continuing out to America with the third-class steerages full of Arabs, rats, and hungry cockroaches. She says, too, that those Arabs were Orthodox Christians who were leaving their lands carrying Ottoman passports. They were fleeing from military service, which is the same as saying they were fleeing from the war where they would be cannon fodder. They were fleeing because staying was an impossibility, a risk, a penitence. My paternal grandparents did the same thing. They escaped from the hunger the years of drought caused. They fled the dispossession of lands that President Porfirio Diaz's policies caused by the late 19th century. They left behind a radical poverty in which stomach disease, like dysentery, was a death sentence. Revueltas, Jose Revueltas, a very prolific and actually a very good writer, writes in Human Mourning, a novel that I actually recommend to you. This is a wonderful piece of work. This is a novel about the Mexican North, about the border, that the poor looking for their own place on earth have no other option than to walk fervently, to walk that life depended on it. Even though the train tracks that united San Luis Potosí with the border had stretched out since the end of the 19th century, I believe my grandparents, who didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, walked the entire route north. It was, as Jose Revueltas writes in this book, and here I'm quoting, absolutely essential that they keep walking now that they had no place, that they keep walking intensely in search of themselves, because even though they might be defeated, something deep inside was whispering to them that salvation existed. Another very important author, Gloria Anzaldúa, the Chicano author, also an inhabitant of the border between Texas and Tamaulipas, does not stop reminding us either that there is among us migrants a tradition of long walks. There is always someone who has migrated before. That's what I'm trying to say. When we believe we have embarked on this journey with no return, this displacement that subdivides or multiplies into many more, in reality, we are fitting the soles of our feet into the footsteps that others have left behind. There is no tabula rasa. We are just guests on the surface of a land that we experience in common. Someone was here where I am, and someone else will be here after my stay. Someone spoke this language, a language that was denied again and again. The reason for that absence are the very thing of politics. The reason for the presence are the very thing of politics. Between them and us, in any case, there is a bridge that has a strong memory because it is organic and material, because it affects us and we affect it. Those who write from the United States, those of us who write from the United States do not have the luxury of forgetting that we continue to write in migration. Let me see. Maybe continue with another important topic right here. We have experienced much loss recently. Many of us have either lost a relative or a friend, or know of someone close who has herself or himself lost a mother or a father of a friend or a cousin to COVID-19, to the pandemic, especially due to the incompetent handling of the pandemic during its early stages. So I trust most of us have received or about to receive either 1 or 2 vaccine shots by now. And as we prepare to adapt to the new normalcy, I wrote another piece that was included right here at the end of this book. The title of this piece in Spanish is Del Verbo Tocar, translated by Sarah Booker as Touching is a Verb, the Hands of the Pandemic and Its Inescapable Questions. It's a long essay, but I'm going to read to you the last a section of the last subchapter of these, because I, as many of you, I'm rather suspicious of going back, as they say, to the old normalcy, and I'm eager to participate, to contribute to a new normalcy, one that addresses the cruel inequalities that have structured our world so far. So here I go. Like a giant X-ray, the deceleration the pandemic has brought makes clear or even exaggerates what was already present, what we already knew, an economic system guided by profit at the expense of everything else, and a visceralist state, that is, a state for which bodies are not a matter of care, but merely of extraction. The worst that could happen to us, Arundhati Roy convincingly argued, is to return to that savage normality. And I would add, to that merciless world which, imprisoned by the evil spell of disembodiment, is incapable of recognizing the ties of reciprocity that unite us with others and with the earth. Indeed, the inescapable awareness of a material closeness with others might come mixed with anxiety and unease, but also with potentiality. Another word is possible. That's what life clearly tells us when it imposes itself over the pandemic. Will it be possible then, from all this experience with illness, to overthrow that visceralist normalcy once and for all and participate at the same time in the emergence of a state with heart and flesh, muscle and cartilage? In other words, how will we resolve to demand that the state comply with its responsibility to protect the health of the population while we simultaneously produce embodied relations, that is, modes of effect and connections that stem from the broad admission that we are bodies, that we need and can provide care? It is evident to me that at least in the United States, this struggle begins and is intimately tied to the absence of a public health system that, by virtue of not existing, has sentenced a large number of workers to routine death, and especially essential workers. And now that the pandemic has also confirmed this status, many of whom continue to be considered illegal by this incompetent and genocidal government. In that sense, the fight for a public health system and the fight for migration reform are in reality the same fight. Both are centered primarily on the fundamental assertion that we are bodies, and consequently on the basic fact that so many bodies depend on each other in seriously altered ecological contexts. The macro measures, changes to public health on a state level, for example, should not go against and in fact must complement smaller quotidian community measures. And these together might be able to unlock the harmful alliance of state and corporation and their intrusion in our health system. On its own, the pandemic, which has helped us clearly see the brutal disposition of our time, will not create visceral relations, embodied relations, I say, with others in material connection to our communities that could well lay the groundwork for another reality. We could do well to attend to these questions that rematerialization compels and in fact makes inescapable. The beginning of the end of indolence depends on these answers and on these actions. And this is, for me, this is quite something. I might be perhaps too optimistic right now, but I think we're facing altogether a really important opportunity. And I guess that's the reason why I want to end this reading, the beginning of this conversation, by reading some of the lines, some of the phrases, small paragraphs that I included in the very last chapter of Grieving. The title of this section is Keep Writing. And you might translate writing by, keep doing what you love, by keep living to the fullest, keep meeting others, keep caring for others. Because we become social in language. My I for you, your you for me, our you all for them. Because writing by nature invites us to consider the possibility that the world can, in fact, be different. Because the secret mechanism of writing is imagination. Because imagination is another word for criticism, and this the other word for subversion. Because those who write will never adapt. Because memory. Because writing teaches us that nothing is natural. Things are closer than they appear. Writing also tells us that. Because it is through that rectangular artifact we call a book that we communicate with our dead. And all of the dead are our dead. Because a sentence produces memories that will be inhabited by the names of Marco and Jose Luis Piña Dávila, Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, January 30th, 2010. Because belonging is something I do through you, sentence. Because at the end of each line, there is an abyss worth tumbling into or launching yourself into or disappearing into. Because look how the verb to burst bursts out of itself. Because a line is an imprecation or a prayer. Because terror stops there, where the word terror stops, inscribed. Because there are voices that come from afar, from below, from beyond. Because a sentence produces memories that will be inhabited forever by the name of Lucila Quintanilla, Monterrey, Nuevo León, October 6, 2010. Because a paragraph is an extreme sport. Because words are necessary to say, I do not extend my hand to you, Señor Presidente. I cannot welcome you. Because language is a form of opposition that always takes us elsewhere. Because it is only through writing that the here is founded, because of the now. Because while the violence invades and acquires unprecedented forms, contemporary language has difficulty giving it plausible names. Martín and Brian Almanza, Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, Matamoros, April 2010. Because in the rectangle of a page, I am nourished and I dream and I plunged and I die. Because there too, I am reborn. We are reborn. Because the word shard, the word soldier, the word impunity. Because this is the most definitive form of the collective. Because when faced with the questions, is it worth it to get up early in the morning just to keep writing? Can writing, in fact, be something that acts against fear or terror? Since when has a page stopped a bullet? Has someone ever used a book as a shield over their chest, just above their hearts? Is there a protected zone somewhere invincible around a written text? Is it possible not to mention desirable, to grab or will erase a word? My answer continues to be yes. Because yes is a small and sacred and savage word all at the same time. Because a sentence produces memories that will be inhabited forever by the name of Cristina Rivera Garza, Mexico City, July 16, 1990. Because I do not forget, because I will not forget, because we will never forget. So thank you so much for your attention. I would like to open up now our time for our Q&A session.
Thank you very much. Before we start, could I ask you if you have it handy, would it be possible for you to read the poem also in Spanish now?
Let me see if I have the poem in Spanish, you know.
You have a request for that.
Yeah, I do. That's
Just to hear it come from your voice, your embodied sound of the
That's
word.
that's a really pertinent request. Unfortunately, it will take me some time to get to that Spanish version. So
Okay.
perhaps I can look for that as we continue with the conversation, and perhaps we can close with that.
No worries. Okay. I encourage our audience to pose your questions. Let me start with the question. While you were talking about grieving, I was thinking about how it's different than mourning, and wanted to know if you could say something about that. And what occurred to me is that mourning ends. Grieving, as you're talking about it, is generative.
Yeah.
It creates things. It's critical. It spawns new awarenesses and filiations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my question is, could you talk about the difference? Have you thought about mourning and grieving, and does grieving end?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. Thank you for asking that. And as I was mentioning during the reading in itself, it's been complicated just to translate the word dolerse, which in fact is not duelo. No, it's not what the literal translation of grieving or mourning would be more appropriately translated by using the word duelo in Spanish. So it's I was trying to make some sense of a definition of this shared pain, very much along the lines that you were mentioning. And that's the reason why the concept that Christina Sharp was exploring in this book, In the Waking, was so important to me. The very concept of wake work, because I do believe that in this grieving, which it doesn't have an end, a clear end, and which necessarily involves the production of these filiations, of these linkages to one another and to community as such, is also a process that is, as I try to argue through these chronicles and essays and poetry, is a moment of awareness, of radical awareness, a moment in which we consciously move away from indifference and we move away from indolence. And so by doing that, and which to me is a way of fully engaging with the world in which we live, right? And to fully do so, I think we have to be willing to embrace that extreme experience, which is pain. Many times, as I try to explain in this book, many of these varied forms of social suffering are caused by intrinsic violence, by the violence generated by extractive economies and the governments that represent them. And many of these this range of social suffering experiences are also connected to wars. And in case of Mexico, I am constantly going back to this misnamed war on drugs that has unleashed a conflict affecting thousands and thousands of families in ways that are profound and that are leaving its mark in our psyche and in the way that we relate to the world. So my idea here again is that opening up to the possibility of experiencing this pain of others is not a way of falling into fatalism or thinking of victims as passive actors throughout all these experiences. Just the opposite. I think once pain forces us to think back about the causes of our misfortune, then pain in that way is generative and is critical, because there is no way that we can accept the pain and loss just come out of nowhere. We create an explanation with others, and that I think is a very matter of the potency, the possibility of a different kind of future. That's in any case what I'm betting for in this. Mm-hmm.
Your discussion and the comments you made today about vulnerability strikes me as aiming for something similar, in that vulnerability becomes a source of strength. In other words, it's not pure, it's not a threat as you describe vulnerability.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that? What you see as the sort of the inevitable, the ubiquity of vulnerability, which is often denied, and where it becomes also a sort of generative as well, right? You talked about our dependency, our interdependency, but it's something more. It's the thing that makes you able to notice, right, the world around you.
You know, I think sometimes we are suspicious of the word vulnerability because we mistake that word for being rendered defenseless.
Right.
And that's different. Yeah, I think vulnerability is at the core of what makes us human animals, members of human communities, and even beyond that, with what makes our existence on Earth unique too. Being rendered defenseless, on the other hand, is an artificial situation, and that's when we are prey of forces larger than our own. But on the other hand, as a writer myself, I have to admit that that's the place from that facilitates my writing. I couldn't write a single word if I were not trying, at least attempting, to get close to that space of vulnerability, which is always a space of contact, right? You have to be very familiar or flexible with what is unknown in order to write. So there is that sense of being vulnerable to forces outside your own, to be not really on control. I mean, I try to be in control of my tools, but not really about the matters that I'm trying to approach through writing. And I think this, which is a vulnerability that belongs to what I do, to my practice as a writer, is also present in most of the meaningful interactions we have with the world. And so cherishing that, nourishing that vulnerability, I think that's what makes us understand something that might sound quite odd right now. We live in a world in which autonomy, self-reliance, independence are given value. Yeah, and here I am saying, really, what we need to be paying attention to, if we want to fully engage with this world, is that we radically depend on one another, and that what we can do for each other will define the type of world that we want to live in.
Here's a question from an audience member. Would you be able to talk about how the current visual arts is representing the same feelings and memory you talk of in your writing and reading?
Let me see, visual arts in, I made a couple of references to that. And in fact, I used several passages, several ideas by mostly Mexican artists, struggling with representing, working with the materials of this world surrounded, crisscrossed by violence. Many of them are working with the materials such as corpses, such as the traces, the ruins of the afterlife of much of this violence that we have experienced in the last decades. And the names, of course, right now escape me. as is very fitting for an event like this. And I will remember this at the end of the conversation. I will be on now. But obviously there is an important interconnection between what visual artists are trying to go through, to express, and the kind of roads that they are opening as well, in terms of understanding and in terms of healing as well. So I'm very much interested in that, with certain aspects of contemporary art, especially with interventions and with performances, in a very unique use of these materials.
Another question. Could we think of Dolerse in the way you use it as being an active act that embodies acknowledging and paying respect to the pain of others? Well,
that's a wonderful definition. I would like to know who asked that. Silvia Bermudez. That would be. I'm going to use that as when I'm asked in the future what my book is about. I'm going to use that as a definition. I think it's wonderful. It includes aspects that are very dear to me and that I've been thinking a lot about. Acknowledging, recognizing our presence among others, and on the other hand, while doing that, at the same time, respecting also that experience. It's been told, and I do believe that we cannot fully apprehend, the complexity of another human being. There is always something that is fleeing, something that is escaping. And I think pain is one of those extreme experiences that are not easily captured, and they shouldn't. In many ways, right? So respecting the acknowledging that possibility and respecting at the same time the fraught bridge that might make that experience knowledgeable or not knowledgeable to us, I think is very important too. So it's not a matter of living under the illusion that we will be able to capture someone else's experience. But indeed that we will be making the effort, and this is an effort of the imagination, it is an effort of empathy, right? In trying to bridge that distance that essentially connects us.
Let me piggyback a related question about how this kind of pain, grief, can be an intra-action against state-sponsored violence. And how it can be a communal action to build alternative futures. Could you speak to that?
Well, absolutely. That's one of that's a beating heart of this book. And that's it's very much related to another concept that I very briefly touched upon during the presentation, and that is the concept of un estado sin entrañas. And for my colleagues in the Spanish department trying to translate that right now, they must be facing what Sarah Brooker and I try to come to terms with in terms of how do you say this in English? Un estado sin entrañas in Spanish means literally is a state without organs, without guts, right? But obviously I was trying to make this play on words possible in Spanish between entrañas and entrañable, which is an adjective meaning something that is endearing. So I was trying to differentiate between a state which I am locating chronologically during the early 20th century, a post-revolutionary state, at least formally interested in the well-being of its citizens, to a radical transformation that took place later in the 20th century when the state espousing the values of what we know as neoliberalism simply relinquished this responsibility, thus becoming un estado sin entrañas and a visceralist state in English. So we didn't find that word, that entraña, but we thought that viscera is a word in English that involves, well, on the one hand, it invokes the physicality of the body, and at the same time, it relates to specific temperament. So it's not the same kind of temperament, because endearing is it's rather different than being visceral, right? But at least there is that linguistic connection at that level. So what I'm trying to argue in this book, and I think is central to this whole discussion, is that these instances of social suffering are not just God-given, are not just pumping out of the balloon, that this is engineered, so to speak. This is part of the design of extractive economies, systems, political and economic systems organized around specific practices and the values stemming from those practices. So that's why when I'm saying that in creating this empathy, in working through these empathetic relationships, when it comes to pain, when it comes to answer the question about the ultimate origins of this pain, we have to go back to that root, to extraction, to exploitation, to processes of accumulation. And without that, I think this whole discussion would be just, it would become a rather individualistic discussion about, what one single person can or cannot do. And I'm trying to move into a different direction, right? I'm trying to see how the state-making efforts hurt people in very specific ways, and how these people in touch with one another, doing what we can do for each other, can in fact fight back, can in fact create and reproduce our communities, not eschewing pain, but just doing the opposite, embracing it and bringing with us and for us all that potency.
Okay, here are two questions that really build upon what you're saying and decenter the solitary self in that regard. Could you speak to the concept of transhumanism in the context of your remarks? And then a comment: is not the corporate state at this very moment taking a worldwide advantage of the pandemic to roll out their plans for extracting a rate of return on their derivative investments in the healthcare assessments of our collective peoples presently on the planet?
Yeah. Let me see. Those are very important and very complex questions, of course, and we only have a couple of minutes to talk about that. But let me just very briefly try to answer them. The more I started, the more I thought about human pain, the more I had to pay attention to our companion species, as Donna Haraway would say. The more that organic, inevitable structural relationship with territory, between territories and bodies, has become prominent in my work. I think Autobiography of Cotton, the book that I mentioned earlier, is perhaps the continuation of this train of thought, but related specifically to an experiment that the Mexican government organized in the 1930s and 40s, propitiating the cotton agriculture. But it was a very interesting project. On the one hand, it did produce wealth. On the other hand, and the social mobility that comes usually with that. And in that sense, I could be like an example of that. But on the other hand, the form that was chosen to develop this project, which was through monochrome crop, no, it essentially destroyed the soil, altering the ecology of the region. And it is my argument in the book that while producing wealth in the short term, it essentially ended up by committing what some call a terricide. The killing of the earth as such. And that's how we opened up the door to violence and to the so-called war on drugs in more recent times. So there is a way in which the pain that I'm speaking of so far in this book, in Grieving, is not only limited to the human presence on earth. I think it's always important, especially if we want to link that to processes of accumulation and extraction to beings other than human in our time right now, in times of the Capitalocene, and times in which extinction as such is very much possible. And in terms of oh my gosh, do I have time for that? In terms of the corporate state, yeah, I think what we are saying, and that I try to address that in that section about the new normalcy. I shared my concern with many of you about that very possibility. I don't want to go back to that normalcy. I think we are now facing the possibility of creating a different kind of futurity. And but obviously that doesn't mean that that the enemy, that the forces, the powers that be are just they're just waiting to see what we do. I think there's going to be a very strenuous fight for the world that we want to build in the near future. And that's the reason why I thought that publishing Grieving at this point in time would be a good idea. This is a book that I first published some 10 years ago, very much in relationship to Mexico. But for this edition, this translation into English, we decided, Sarah Booker and myself decided to incorporate new essays, some very much related to the United States, to the relationship between Mexico and the United States, and our shared processes of grieving, the possibility of creating these transnational communities of emotional communities that might bring empathy to our situation on Earth. I think that's very important. And so the book is right here, to me, is my way of contributing at least to that conversation as one of the possibilities, one of the palpitations, one of the intimations that we might want to work through in the near future. In any case, it is an invitation.
And our hour is over. I want to thank you and just say that we indeed did have a dialogue, but also what strikes me is that your own writing, as you described it, is a dialogue. You talked about the way your task in this book was to configure a space of listening and grieving, so that you are in dialogue with these voices, these agentive voices, and you are framing them and giving them a kind of interlocution, if that's a word. So thank you for that. And thank you for this wonderful hour. Thank you, audience members, for attending. I would ask you to please fill out your survey when you leave our IHC virtual room, and to have a lovely evening. Good night, everybody.
Gracias a todos.